Hi everyone, welcome to Learning Impact. In today's lecture, we will discuss Karl Marx, his brief introduction, and then we will discuss the basic terminologies that include the mode of production, means of production, and relations of production. Then we will go for his major concept, that is historical materialism and economic determinism, and then we will draw conclusion at last. So let's start. Okay, first is Karl Marx. Let's look into his brief introduction. Karl Marx was born in 1818 and was died in 1883. We have studied the detailed biography of Karl Marx in our last lecture, and here we will just give an overview of his introduction. So he was born in 1818 and was died in 1883. He was born in Germany. He was a German philosopher and sociologist who was born in Germany, which was formerly known as Prussia, and his political ideology is known as the Marxism. Much of his political ideology is collectively known as the Marxism, and which is mostly part of his conflict theory. Conflict theory is his point of view about his theory about the have and have not class, that how under the capitalist system there is bourgeoisie and the proletarian class, and they are always in conflict with each other. And then he focused on a critique of the capitalist economic system. He gave more importance to study the economic system of the capitalism, and he was believing that capitalist system is a system which is exploitative by nature. It exploit the proletarian class and give benefits to the industrialists because it worked in the favor of the ruling class. And his philosophy was influenced by the other philosophers, including Rousseau, Hegel. Hegel is considered one of the idealist philosophers whose philosophy is part of the German ideology. And Hegel, which we have studied in our previous lecture, Hegel philosophy is very much similar but at the same time different from the Karl Marx. Hegel gave the concept of dialect. Karl Marx adopted that concept but with some modification and changes. Hegel was idealistic, so he was believing that the center of contradiction is idea, but Marx believed that the center of contradiction is matter, because Marx was more materialistic and Hegel was more idealistic. And Karl Marx's philosophy was also influenced by the Charles Darwin and the Adam Smith, who is considered one of the classical economists. Karl Marx studied Adam Smith at the British Museum, and he adopted many concepts of Adam Smith and did some modifications to it, like the concept of commodity, concept of capital. It was first introduced by Adam Smith, as it is more associated with economy, and then Charles Fourier. And there are also some other philosophers who were inspired by the Karl Marx philosophy, who we know as a neo-Marxist. These philosophers include John Ravis, Althusser, Gramsci, Mao, and Lenin. These are those who were influenced by the Karl Marx philosophy. So this was the brief introduction of Karl Marx. Now we will discuss the basic terminologies which you must know about Karl Marx before we go into his larger theory, that is about the historical materialism and the dialect and the economic determinism. The basic terminologies which you must understand that include the mode of production. What does it mean by the mode of production? Mode of production is the organization of the economic production and activity in a given society which is necessary to satisfy needs. Means that it is a kind of organization of economic production and any economic activity that is going on in our society. The organization of that economic activity which help us to satisfy needs. This is the mode of production. All the economic activity collectively known as the mode of production. This is all what does it mean. And the mode of production, it depends on two factors that include the means of production and the relations of production. Now, what does it mean by the means of production and the relations of production? First is the means of production. Means of production is the way in which people provide for their material needs. The ways in which people provide means all the things which they utilize. For example, under the capitalist system, it prevails in the industrialist society. So the way in which people provide for the material needs under the capitalist system is through industries. And also, for example, if we take the feudalist system, in which the feudal lords, they were deriving their wealth from land. So what was the way in the feudalist system to meet their material needs? That was the land. They were using the land. to derive the wealth and to fulfill their material needs. So the ways in which people provide for their material needs, this is called the means of production. It includes all the physical things which we utilize to have products which can help us to satisfy our financial needs. So the means of production include the natural resources which we utilize in the form of raw material, and also there are the machines, factories, land, capital, labor. These all are included in the means of production. But in means of production, there is also include the means of distribution. It is not only about the physical, it's mostly about the physical elements that are used to produce capital, goods and services of the economic system. But at the same time, means of production also include means of distribution. That how do we distribute the products among the masses? In order to distribute the products among the masses, what do we need? We need infrastructure, we need transport system, we need railways, we need roads, and all these means of transportation is also included in our means of production, because it helps us to satisfy our needs and to also help us to transfer the product from one place to another, and to help us to distribute it among the masses. So the means of production is also included the means of distribution. So means of distribution include the stores, railroads, infrastructure. This is a vital part of the means of production. So we can say that all the things that has some kind of physical appearance, like the natural resources, the raw materials, but at the same time, the labor and the capital, the commodity, these all are the means of production. So the ways in which people provide for their material need, this is the means of production. All the things which they utilize in order to produce product for themselves, that is the means of production. Now the second is the relations of production. What does it mean by relations of production? It is the kinds of association that people have with each other in satisfying their needs. The kind of association means the kind of relationship that these people have with each other. Now, these relations of production depend on the means of production. For example, if we take the capitalist system, where the means of production is the industries, the relations of production will always be between the capitalist and the worker, because the population depend on two classes. The whole population divided into two classes, that is the capitalist and the working class. So what kind of relation do they have with each other? This is the relations of production. These relations of production is also used to satisfy their needs. And what kind of relation is this between them? Capitalists, they try to exploit the worker by deriving more and more profit they can from the workers' labor, and in turn the labor work for the capitalist, and also they tend to look for anyone who can pay them for their labor. This is the relations of production that exists between them. For example, we can say that the relations of production depend on the means of production. If there is a feudalist society, in that society there are two types of classes, that is the feudal lords and the serfs who work on lands. So what kind of relation is this between them? That the feudal lords, they show moral obligation to wage laborers, and in return the serf, they have some kind of feelings of personal loyalty to the feudal lords, and they work for them. But in case of the capitalist system, there are also two type of classes, that is the capitalist and the worker. The capitalist, under the capitalist system, the capitalists show no moral obligation to labor. And then what happened in return, that the proletarian class, they are willing to sell their labor whoever can pay for it. Means that they do not show any kind of integrity or any kind of loyalty which most of the serfs show in case of the feudal system. So this is what we call relationship, that what kind of relationship exists between what kind of association exists between these two classes, and whatever the capitalists do and whatever the workers do, their main purpose is to satisfy their needs. So they all work together in order to satisfy their needs. So we can call the relations of production as the property relation. Why do we call it the property relation? Because it is based on the ownership. One group is the capitalist class, who have the ownership of the means of production, like the raw materials, the labor, the capital, commodities. They have the control and ownership of all the means of production. On the other hand, there is another class which we call the proletarian class, who has no ownership, who do not own the means of production. That's why it is called a property relation, which depend on the ownership. And then for example, if you take the relations of production in the feudalist society, there is a kind of relation that exists, as we just discussed, that the serf are those who work on the lands of the feudal lords. So they have a kind of feeling of personal loyalty to the feudal lords, and the feudal lords also show some more obligations to, give them considerable and suitable wages. And on the other hand, under the capitalist system, the proletarian willing to sell their labor to whoever will pay for it, because proletarian class does not have any kind of personal loyalty and personal feeling with the capitalist, as the serf have with the feudal lords in a feudalist system. So this is all about the relations of production, that what kind of association people have with each other to satisfy their needs. So this was the mode of production, the means of production, and the relations of production. Okay, now what does Karl Marx mean by the concept of dialect? It is also important to understand his concept of dialect before we go into detail of the historical materialism. What does it mean by the word dialect? Dialect means discussion. So what does it mean by discussion? Discussion means the study of something. So Karl Marx was believing that the discussion or the study of the centrality of contradiction is matter. Means that what does he mean by the centrality of contradiction? He was believing that a society passed from one phase to another, and he actually gave some stages of it, which we'll discuss later on this lecture. He believed that the society progress result from the conflict of opposing forces. There is always a kind of contradiction. Contradiction means that there is a kind of contrasting and opposing interest of different classes. So, and what is the center of this contradiction? The center of this contradiction is matter, according to Karl Marx. It is because that these two classes have the contrasting interests, because they have the unequal ownership of the material things. He was giving more importance to the economy. He was giving more importance to the material thinkers as compared to the Hegel. Hegel is considered one of the German idealists who was believing that the centrality of contradiction is idea. He was believing that it is something wrong in our understanding, but Karl Marx believed that the centrality of contradiction is matter. So we can say that the word dialect means discussion. He actually did the discussion or the study of the centrality of contradiction. Contradiction, as we just discussed, is the contrasting relation or the contrasting interest of two classes under the capitalist system. So what is the centrality of contradiction according to Marx? According to Marx, this contradiction is not something in our idea, which Hegel said that it is something, the centrality of contradiction is idea because it is something wrong in our understanding. Marx said that it is something real, it is something existing contradiction that has some ground reality. And Marx believed that dialectical philosophy believed that contradiction exists in reality, and that the most appropriate way to understand reality is to study the development of this contradiction. So Karl Marx was believing that if we want to have better understanding of development of society, we have to study these contradictions, because at each phase of the society developed, the society was there was a contradiction at each phase, and this contradiction was among the different classes of society at that time. So this was his concept of dialect. Now we will discuss his concept of historical materialism. Historical materialism of Karl Marx is the philosophy of history, which claimed that history is moved by the conflict of material and economic forces from primitive communism to capitalist one. It is a philosophy of history which he claimed that history is moved by the conflict. Means that when we look in history, we will come to know that the society passed through different stages, and at each stage there was a kind of conflict within the society, and the conflict was between the different classes that were existing at that time, at that point of history in that society. So history is moved by the conflict. And what was this conflict about? This conflict was always about the economic forces and the material forces, because Karl Marx gave more importance to the economic factors rather than ideas and understandings, because he was a materialist thinker. So he gave more importance to material forces, and he believed that there was always a contradictions in society, and this contradictions was about the material forces, and in that way society moved from primitive communism to capitalist one. And he gave different stages that how society passed from primitive communism to capitalist one. He believed that the center of any progressive movement in history is matter. Whenever we try to trace the history, whenever we try to understand it, we will come to know that there is always a matter which was the center of contradiction at each phase of the society progress, because every class of the society at every point of history, they were striving to have more access to the material needs rather than about ideas and the understandings. It was always about the material forces. This conflict, this race, this was always about the material needs. And this historical materialism, as it is all about the conflict of material forces, so this is also known as the materialistic interpretation of history, or we can also call it economic interpretation of history. And then we can say that this historical materialism of Karl Marx, it is based on his famous well-known ideology, well-known philosophy, that is the economic determinism. Economic determinism is one of his popular concept which he gave, and in all of his most of his philosophy based on his concept of economic determinism. Now, what does he mean by economic determinism? He believed that economic determinism, he said that the ways in which people provide for their material needs. As we discussed, the ways in which people provide for their material needs, it means he was referring to the means of production. As we just discussed, we just defined it, that the means of production is all about the ways in which people, they satisfy their material needs. So the ways in which people provide for their material needs, it determine, or in general, condition the relations that people have with each other. The relation that people have with each other is all about the what we call the relations of production. So if we try to conclude it, what does he want to say? That this is the means of production that determine our relations of production, also determine our social institutions and even the prevalent ideas. This is all what he means by the economic determinism, that our means of production means the way in which people provide for their material needs, it determine their conditions, the relations that people have with each other, it determine the property relations. This is all about the economic determinism. So he was believing that there is always the economic organization of society, which he labeled as base, okay? And he believed that this economic organization of society actually determined the superstructure. The superstructure which he labeled, and he say that what is the superstructure about? Superstructure is all about the laws, government, education, religion, art, belief, and value, which is something internal, which is something about our ideology. And he believed that this base and the superstructure, base actually determine the superstructure, and he collectively called this Base-Superstructure model. Now, what does he mean by this Base-Superstructure model? Let's break down this concept. Base-Superstructure model is the economic determinism or Base-Superstructure model or the materialist interpretation of history. These all are the same, okay? So the economic determinism, which was based on his Base-Superstructure model, the base consists of the forces of production, and the force of production which we just discussed, forces and the means of production is just same. So the force of production include the resources and the technology. Under the capitalist system, the force of production is industries. What happened that these forces of production, it leads to the relations of production. It determines our relations of production. And what are the relations of production under the capitalist system? According to Marx, it is the social relationship that exists, and the social relationship is all about the class structure. And what is the class structure about? It is about the bourgeoisie and the proletarian class that exists under the capitalist system. So it means that the force of production determines the class structure. And this is, we can take this concept to understand the feudalist societies also, that in that society the force of production is different, that is the land ownership, and it determined their relations of production, which is also got changed because the force of production got changed. So the relations of production in that case is the different structure, that is the feudal lords and the serfs. But in case of the in case of the capitalism, there is a class structure which is based on the bourgeoisie and the proletarian class. So Karl Marx was believing that the forces of production leads to it determined the relations of production. What kind of means of production a society has, according to that force of production, there will be a relations of production. The relations of production that is more compatible, that is more aligned to the means of production will exist. So it leads to what he called these forces of production, these relations of production. This whole he called is the economic and the material foundation of our society. He said that these forces of production, the relations of production, these all collectively make our economic foundation. And this whole structure, as he labeled it as a base. He said that it is the base. As we discussed, it is the base-superstructure model. So what was he referring to base in this title? He was referring to all this force of production, relations of production, and the economic and the material foundation of our society. And he believed that on this base there erected a superstructure, which he believed that the superstructure consists of all the other aspects of the social culture. All the other aspects means all the non-economic aspects. All the non-economic aspects are included in this. All the economic aspect is included in the base portion, and in case of the superstructure, there are all the non-economic aspect of our society. That include the law, forms and principles of government, also political theory, philosophy, religion, art, moral codes, religion. These all are our superstructure, which he labeled as a superstructure. And he was believing that it is the economic and the material foundation that leads to determine the superstructure. And that's why this is known as the base-superstructure model. He was believing that base is all about the economic aspect of our society, and the superstructure is all about our non-economic aspect of our society. And he was believing that the superstructure has mainly two functions. Superstructure provide the commanding class. We also call the ruling class as a commanding class, and also the industrialist class, also the capitalist class. These all are same, okay? So he believed that it provides the commanding class of society with a justification and rationalization of its position. A commanding class always universalizes its own position. The laws it enacts, the moral behavior it advocates, the religion it embraces, all assume the rightness of its place in society. Means that all this philosophy, art, moral codes, religion, it is all according to the ruling class, that how they behave, what kind of religion they embrace, what kind of moral codes they praise, what kind of art they appreciate, and then the whole society then follow them. So the superstructure act as a justification, rationalization for the ruling class. It is always in favor of ruling class. And he believed that the superstructure has also another function, that it helps the ruling class to maintain their status quo. It acts as a weapon of the commanding class to maintain its own superior status and subordinate the status of the obeying class. And laws are formulated, as the superstructure also contains the laws. So Karl Marx believed that laws are always formulated to protect the property and authority of the ruling class, and that's why it is mostly difficult to overcome this oppression. And he believed that if you want to bring a change in society, what he called the communist revolution, we must begin with the economic foundation. Whatever we do with the superstructure, for example, in case of the French Revolution, there was a political liberation and the constitutional freedom, the constitutional protection, what they got as a result. Karl Marx actually disapproved the French Revolution. He was believing that this French Revolution and such kind of other revolutions will not prove fruitful, because it is mostly the freedom which we get, it is mostly the partial freedom. It is just the freedom that is superficial. If we want to have full emancipation, we must begin with the economic foundation. This economic foundation should be shaken, it should be changed. And how can we change the economic foundation? We have to change these forces of production. We have to begin to change the force of production, which will in turn lead to the changes in the relations of production. And as the base will get changed, so the superstructure itself will get changed. And if we start to change the principles of government, and if we try to adopt the some laws that can protect our rights, or if we try to give some philosophical explanations of things, if we try to adopt the moral codes that the ruling class is following, this all will have no use. It will not prove fruitful, because what we have to do is to start from the economic foundation. This is all what he talk about the economic determinism. He believed that governments are designed to enable the commanding class to enforce its will, although in all stages of historical development. And he believed, except the last one, he believed that there will be a state, there will be a society at last, which he called the communist society. And he believed at that point there will be no authority in the hands of the ruling class, because that will be the rule of majority, not the rule of minority. And he believed that these members of the both classes, they mostly think in the same way. He believed that the members of the two classes, they think in the same way, because he believed that the proletariat is a part of the society in which the superstructure is governed by the ruling class. So he believed that is this art, moral codes, religion, this all has been dominated by the ideologies of the ruling class. So of course it has succeeded to instill the ideologies of the ruling class in the minds of the proletariat. That's why they mostly think in the same terms, and that's why the ruling class has become successful to convince the working class that there is some kind of superior trait in them. That's why they are the ruling class, and they have convinced the working class that they have some kind of abilities that they are lacking. That's why they have been forced into that labor. And Karl Marx believed that such kind of ideologies have been instilled so much in the mind of the working class that working class are themselves doubting their own capabilities, and they are believing that the ruling class has some kind of superior activities, some kind of superior traits, which Karl Marx strongly denounced and believed that this is not about the superior and the inferior traits, but it is all about that how the capitalist system works, how the superstructure is promoting the ideologies of the working class and helping to oppress the working class. This is all what he mean by the economic determinism. Okay, then his theory of historical materialism. Historical materialism actually this is the history of society. If we give focus to this title, historical materialism, he studied the history, means the progress of society from one phase to another, by giving reference to the material things, by keeping the material forces at the center of the study. This is what we call the historical materialism. The society has moved through a number of modes of production, and he called these all societies he termed as these are the 5 stages which are identified, that include the primitive society, ancient society, feudal society, capitalist society, and communist society. And he was believing that at each phase there were different means of production and relations of production, and there was then some kind of exploitation which lead to the emergence of another society. So let's begin with the primitive society. Okay, primitive and the tribal society is the first phase which he identified. And he believed that this is a stage at which the society was a primitive communism, means that there was no concept of exploitation. So we will look into this table in which I have talk about the means of production, relations of production, and exploitations. So what were the means of production in the primitive society? They were the primitive tools which they were using in the primitive society. That was the wooden sticks, the stones, bows, and arrows for hunting and food processing. So it was all about the society of hunting and gathering. And in this society, it was characterized by the scarcity, where everyone was struggling for mere survival with little or no technology advancement. And the relations of production was that there was no private ownership, there was a collective ownership of the means of production by the community as a whole. And that's why there was no conflict, because there was no concept of private property. And mostly the ownership was based on the mutual assistance and the cooperation. There was no private property, there was collective ownership, and that's why the society was more cohesive. There was more solidarity among the people, because all the things they were owning, it was something they own as a whole. And the exploitation didn't exist because there was no monopoly over the ownership of means of production, as it was owned by the whole community. And the production was also at a very low scale, so there was no concept of surplus also. This is all what he called the primitive society, and which he called the primitive communist society. And then he identified the second phase. The second phase which he identified is the ancient and the slave society. This ancient and slave society is a society which he believed that it is the first class society in history. It was a society when for the first time there was a concept of class, there was a concept of division. And how did it emerge? There was the domestication of animals and cultivation of plants that leads to the surplus concept. As in the hunting and gathering society, as we call the primitive society, there was no concept of surplus. That's why there was no conflict. But in case of the ancient and slave society, there was now domestication of animals, cultivation of land, which lead to emergence of surplus, which lead to the private property and the social inequalities. And it led to two types of classes, which we discuss in the relations of production, that is the master-slave relation. And what was the means of production? That is the bronze and the iron tools which they used. It was a relatively little advanced society as compared to the primitive one. And there was a large-scale agriculture, livestock, and also mining was a technique which they for the first time used in the ancient society. Then the relations of production was all about the relation between the master and slave. Master was absolutely owning the means of production, including the slaves. They were also owning the slaves. We have studied this whole system of slavery, that what does it mean by slavery in the types of the social stratification. If you haven't visited that lecture, you must watch that, because you will be able to understand these details of the slavery system, and you can also add some details to this topic also. So the master and slave relation was the relations of production in this society, in which the master was owning the means of production, including the slaves, and slaves were left with bare minimum necessities to keep them from dying of starvation. And what was the exploitation? That it was considered the starting point of history of the exploitation of man by man. It is a first class system, because it was the first time that the individual was owning other individual, human was owning other human, the master was owning slave. So it is a society where for the first time this concept emerged. This was the concept of slavery. Then he referred to the third stage, which he called the feudal society. And if he believed that the feudal society emerged because there was the production demanded high labor productivity, but slave have no incentive. In case of the society that was the slave society, there was the high labor productivity, but the slaves have no incentive. So they were looking for the society where they also can work to improve their own conditions. So in case of the feudal society, it was sanctified by the medieval church and the monarchies. We have also studied this feudal society, and which is also called the state society in a types of the social stratification. So in this society, it emerged because of the settled agriculture, which paved the way for this. And it is about 9th to 15th century medieval Europe. So the production demanded higher labor productivity, but the slave has no incentive. So the class conflict was manifested in slave revolts. And then the means of production, in case of the feudal society, it is an inanimate source of energy, that is the water and wind energy, the complex agriculture machines and lands. Okay, then the relations of production. Relations of production are the aristocratic landowners and peasants. Aristocratic landowners who exploited the peasants and they owned the agriculture produce. And the peasants, they were living on the land in exchange for the labor, and they were given a small portion of the produce. And then exploitation, that this society was more progressive than slavery system, since the laborer had some incentive to work and could also own some parts of land. This society is considered more progressive because in this society there was a chances for the peasant class to have some kind of ownership. That was a small piece of land, but although it was a small piece of land, but still the society was progressive as compared to a slavery society, because there was no incentive for the slaves to have any kind of ownership. Then the other society which he talked about, that is the capitalist society. And remember that he was believing his major focus was to study the capitalist society. He gave more importance to understand the capitalist society, that how it emerged from the ruins of feudalism, and he was also predicting that how the communist society will emerge out of the ruins of the capitalist society. He was predicting that there will be a communist society in future, which is something inevitable. So this is the main focus, the capitalist society is the main focus of the Karl Marx study. And he believed that the capitalist society emerged because there was a technological advancement, the population got increased, and as there was a more technological advancement, so there was increasing demand for consumption, which caused by the population increase. Also, there was also discovery of new markets through colonialism. It was for the first time when the concept of colonialism started, and which leads to a mass scale production, because some of the other countries, they were colonized by those who for the first time industrialized. This is the concept which we have studied in the theories of the social stratification, in the form of the dependency theory, in the form of the Wallerstein world system theory, which we have just studied in our previous lectures. So the means of production in the capitalist society was the industrial forces, industrial factories, mines, and banking system for the first time emerged in the capitalist society. And then the relations of production was the bourgeoisie class, they owned the means of production, and the working class sell its labor for wages. And the exploitation was that the proletariat were exploited to sell their labor to ensure the survival. The proletariat is legally free, but they are not free from the bourgeoisie class as a whole. They are forced to sell their labor in exchange for wages to ensure their survival. According to Karl Marx, it seemed like the capitalist society is the most free society, but it is not like this. It apparently the working class is free under the capitalist system, but if we look into it deeply, we will come to know that there is some kind of implicit exploitation that is happening, that is something covered. Like the proletarian class, they must sell their labor in order to survive, otherwise they would die of starvation. It is also a kind of slavery, and he believed that the labor activity, the worker activity which he called labor, it has become a kind of unnatural and the boring activity, because the worker has been alienated from their labor, which we will discuss in detail, inshallah, in our next lectures about the concept of alienation. So this was what he talked about the capitalist society, and he was believing that this society emerged after a brief period which he called the dictatorship of the proletariat. So this was the capitalist society, and he was believing that there will be another society which he was predicting will emerge out of the ruins of the capitalist society, because it will not stay forever. This society will face its downfall because of the exploitation, and as the society has passed through the other stages, in that way the society will also pass through this stage and will move into a next phase which we call the communism. So what was his last stage of communist society? He believed that there will be a society what will be this reason behind its emerging, that is the class conflict that exists in a capitalist society. He was believing that a class conflict will become out of control and it will lead to the communist society. And the relations of production will be the social ownership by public as a whole, that there will be there will be no concept of private ownership. And this is what he called the communist society. And the first society which we just discussed, he called that society as a primitive communism. So this society will almost similar to that primitive communist society, where there was no concept of private ownership, and all the resources, they were owned by the community as a whole. There was the kind of the mutual assistance among the individual. So he was believing that in that way there will be a society in which all the means of production, the mode of production, all the things were on by the means of production will owned by the community as a whole, by the society as a whole. And there will be no exploitation. It will be the class system, and it will be the stateless system, because there will be no concept of conflict. So of course there will be no need of state. And then it will be a moneyless society, because everything will be eventually distributed among the members of the society. And he was believing that this communist society will focus, it will be based on a principle that each individual will work according to his capabilities, but they will gain according to his needs. And this is all the the underlying philosophy of the communist society. So this was what he talked about, these 5 stages of the historical materialism. Now we will discuss some criticism which has been brought to the Marx philosophy. Some critics believe that the economic determinism, which was the Base-Superstructure model, it is a faulty premise. They were believing that it is based on the reductionist argument. Actually, Karl Marx studied some of the industrialist society. That's why he was critical of the industrialization, and he was believing that such kind of capitalist society is exploiting the working class. But the critics believe that Karl Marx only studies some types of society, so he do analysis at a small scale, and he overgeneralize and treat it as a evidence, as a universal law for each and every society across the globe. It is not like this. Means that he believed that this what Karl Marx say, it could be treated as a to explain the progress of society, but it cannot be used as evidence to justify each and every exploitation. As per Marx's logic, the revolution should have happened in advanced industrial countries in the West, particularly in England. Thus, many scholars question the economic determinism in a Marxist historical materialism as a reductionist argument. It could be a method of understanding historical changes and transformation, but it is not and should not be taken as a law of history applicable in all societies across the histories, because critics believe that there are also some agrarian societies, and in fact the communist revolution which he was predicting, it never happened to the industrialist society. It just happened to some of the agrarian society, but in that society it never leads to the stateless and the free society. It leads to the more authoritarian societies. So he was believing for also his theory of revolution, which he believed that is something inevitable, something unavoidable. But the society in which we are living today, it has never passed through that phase, and it is still, we are living under the capitalist society. The Karl Marx philosophy is about centuries ago, and still the revolution hasn't never happened because of the adoption of some principle of the welfare state, because the capitalist system has been modified rather to change it from the very base which Karl Marx was predicting. It has been modified by adopting some principles of the welfare state, and it has ensured the protection of the working class by giving them legal protection, by giving them by giving them rights of the labor unions, so that they can raise their voices if they feel they have been exploited. And also they have the there is a minimum threshold salary which has been set by is according to the international standards, and there is also some kind minimum hours for which labor has to work. These all are the international standards that have been set by the international community. That's why the Marx revolution theory has been failed, because it never happened. And the communist revolution historically proved to be failure, although it never happened to the industrialist society, but it happened to the agrarian society. And in that society it was a kind of failure. It was a destruction. It leads to the more authoritarian societies. It never leads to a stateless and the free society which Karl Marx was predicting. Okay, at the end we will draw a conclusion of the whole Karl Marx philosophy. of the historical materialism and economic determinism. This uh, all his philosophy, which we just discussed in this lecture, this was all what he say in his contribution to a critique of political economy. And this a contribution to a critique of political economy is one of his famous publication. And he was referring, let's discuss some of his words, his own words, that how he was referring to all this philosophy. According to Marx, the general conclusion, it is the words of the Marx himself. It's a general conclusion at which I arrive, which Karl Marx is saying that I arrive, and which once reached became the guiding principle of my studies, can be summarized as follows. In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations. Definite relations, he is referring to the relations of production which we just discussed. So these relations of production which are independent of their will, it was not according to the will of the man, but it was namely the relations of production which was appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material force of production. Means that what kind of relations of production was appropriate to the force of production at a particular point in history, the relations of production happen and man entered into that relation. And the totality of these relations of production, which we just discussed, it constitutes the economic structure of society. What was the economic structure of society in the economic determination? That was the real foundation, which we just discussed. It was the economic foundation, which he labeled as the base. So the totality of these relations of production constitute the economic structure of society, that is the real foundation on which arise means he's not talking about the superstructure, on which arise a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. He was believing that the superstructure actually formed the social consciousness of society, because the superstructure was all about the ideas, the thinking, the religion, art, moral course. So it actually made the social consciousness of society. Okay, so it means that the real foundation of the society, which was all about the economic structure, it determined the social consciousness of our society. And the mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. The mode of production means, which we just discussed at the beginning of this lecture, the mode of production was dependent on two factors, that was the means of production and the relations of production. So that mode of production of the material life was conditioning the general process of the social, political, and intellectual. These all are including the superstructure, social, political, and intellectual life. So he was believing, and this is one of his famous quote, that it is not the consciousness of man that determine their existence, but their social existence that determine their consciousness. Means that it is not about the ideas that determine their existence, means that it is not the idea that leads, it is not the superstructure that contain the ideas that lead to the base, but it is the base that is that is the social existence that determine their consciousness. Consciousness is all about the superstructure. So it is the social existence that is the base. The social existence is all about the base, because it's a social relation, the property relations, the means of production, it determines the consciousness. And at a certain stage of development, the material productive force of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, which we just discussed in a form of emergence and exploitation, that how one society emerged out of the other. Because in the slavery society there was no incentive, but then in the other society, which was the feudal society, there was incentive, a kind of incentive for the slavery system. That's why it moved from one society to another, because in the feudal society there was a kind of opportunity for the slavery to have some kind of ownership. That was a small piece of land. So he was talking about that the material productive force of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, and this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, which he called the property relations, within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. So we can say these relations of production as the property relations also. So he was referring to this. Now, let's continue his quotation. Okay, so from the forms of the development of the productive forces, these relations down into their fetters, and then begins an era of social revolution. It means that there was always a conflict between the forces of production and relations of production, which leads to the era of social revolution. And the changes in the economic foundation, which we call the base, which we just discussed in economic structure, it leads sooner or later to the transformation of whole immense superstructure. Means that if there is any change in the economic foundation, it leads to a change in the whole immense of the superstructure. No social order is ever destroyed before all the productive forces for which it is sufficient have been developed, and new superior relations of production never replace older ones before the material conditions for the resistance have matured within the framework of the older society. Means that the material conditions must mature so that it will change into another form, and once it changes into another form, it will then lead to the changes in the relations of production, because we have discussed in the economic determinism that the forces of production was determining the relations of production. And in broad outline, the Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and the modern bourgeoisie modes of production may be designated as the epochs marking progress in the economic development of society. These are all the stages we just discussed. And the bourgeois mode of the production is the last antagonistic form of the social process of production. Antagonistic not in a sense of individual antagonism, but of the antagonism that emanates from the individual's social conditions of existence. So he was believing that the capitalist society is one of the last society where there is a contradiction, because he was believing that there will be another society which will emerge out of the ruins of the capitalist society, that will be the communist society, and there will be a long-lasting peace in that society. So he was believing that this bourgeoisie, which he called the have class, industrialist class, that is in the capitalist system, it exists in that society because the capitalist is the last antagonistic form. There is no other society where there will be contradiction, because it will ultimately lead to a communist society. So he was believing that this antagonistic, I am calling it antagonistic because it is not antagonistic in the sense of individual one. Means that it is not the individual capitalist who is in conflict with the individual proletariat. No, it is the whole class. They are in contrast, in contradiction with each other as a whole bourgeoisie, as a whole proletarian class. So they are always in conflict with each other as a whole class, not as an individual of capitalist, as an individual of proletariat. Okay, but the productive forces developing within the bourgeoisie society create also the material condition for solution of this antagonism. Means there are the productive forces that develop within the bourgeoisie class, which will lead to the material conditions for a solution of this antagonism. And the prehistory of the human society accordingly closes with this social formation. He was believing that in each society there is always a room for the social change, and that's why the social revolution occur, and then change it then leads to the another revolution. So in that same sense, he is saying that within the capitalist system there is also some kind of contradiction which the capitalist system itself has leads to. It itself has leads to such kind of conditions, and these conditions will act as a base for the communist society. So this was all about the Karl Marx, his materialist historical materialism, his the economic determinism, concept of dialect, and all the other basic terminology which we just discussed, that is the modes of production, the means of production, the relations of production. So this was all about the Karl Marx theory of historical materialism and the economic determinism. So this was the end of our lecture. Thank you so much for watching. Leave your questions in the comment section below. And like, share, and subscribe our channel for latest lectures. Thank you.